Today, we're talking with Yvonne Kraus from Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance. You are the executive director. So tell us a little bit about your history with mountain biking in general and also with Evergreen.
No, thanks. It's great to be here, Forrest. Executive director at Evergreen for almost 5 years now, which is kind of amazing. I've been a mountain biker since the early 90s and never thought that I'd be working in the sport, but absolutely love the outdoors, got engaged in off-road triathlons, and from there, long-distance mountain bike racing. And so one of my friends who I've raced with for years saw this job opportunity come up, and she said, you should apply. And I had a great position at the time working for a nonprofit, but I kind of thought that this was such a unique and fun opportunity that it would be sort of a lost opportunity if I didn't apply. And here I am now, 5 years later, and loving my job at Evergreen.
When I started mountain biking, I didn't know anything about trail advocacy. And I imagine there's a lot of people, especially getting into the sport, they don't know what it is. So can you tell us a little bit about what is advocacy when it comes to mountain biking and why is it needed?
Yeah, so Evergreen has been engaged in policy development and advocacy for trails and recreation and public lands protection for really the very beginning of the organization. It's the reason why we came about in 1989 when mountain bikers were losing access to trails, and there was a realization that as mountain bikers, we need to work to give our recreation group and the trails and who gets to use the trails a voice. So my work in advocacy, which is really most of what I do, is giving trails a voice for really three reasons. One is just ensuring access to public lands and making sure that public lands are protected and that we as a recreation group get sort of, to say it in an easy way, the fair share of access to that. Second is to develop new trails, right? Right now, demand is growing so fast and the needs are unmet in multiple areas across the states, certain areas where there are no mountain bike trails whatsoever. And so we advocate there with elected officials to look at what investments are possible, what are the trail opportunities, what public lands are really suitable for mountain bike projects, and where is the need. And then third, advocacy around how trails are used. So that's just general trail etiquette. Where can you ride? What does, a single one-directional trail mean? What does a multi-use trail mean? And what do you need to know about land manager rules and regulations as a responsible recreationist to use the trails well and to make sure they're sustainably managed in the long run?
There are many trail organizations in the Pacific Northwest. Where does Evergreen fit in with all of those?
Yeah, I'd say we partner with all of them. What I will say is that Evergreen stands out and it's a bit unique for two reasons. One, we are the largest mountain bike alliance in the nation, that's statewide. So we're quite large and quite well supported by our community. So we stand out there. The other piece is that we actually have a full-on trail building team that's full-time employed with us year-round. That's pretty unique. The other recreation organizations, I guess, they are very engaged in public land protection and trail maintenance and operations, and that lobbying and advocacy work in Olympia to make sure that investments still come to the recreation industry and trails have the budget to be maintained and operated well, so that you have a good user experience when you're out there. We all work together under a greater umbrella to do our work in Olympia and to lobby for recreation funding. But we are really unique in that we provide for different service areas, the volunteerism, which really what makes Evergreen tick, and that's our source, our history, our beginnings, right? Volunteerism, education, getting youth, more women, and multiple ride opportunity and clinics offered to the community so that we can grow and also grow diversity and equity in our sport. My work in advocacy and policy, and then the trail building arm, which is more than 1/3 of all of our revenues come just from that side, and that's pretty unique.
This was one of my questions, but you bring this up and I'll ask it, is that tell me about diversity and equity. How does that look for mountain biking, and what sort of role is Evergreen playing in that?
Yeah, we just started a diversity and equity committee. I wrote a personal and fairly emotional response to the Black Lives Matter movement, and taking a look in the mirror of our industry, our sport, and our community, and recognizing that we're 99% white, and so is our membership. We are confronting that now and starting committee work and taking a significant amount of time to come up with a proposal to present that to the board. I think what I'm hearing so far is overall, if you ask any mountain biker, most of our community members, number one, support the work that we do in increasing diversity and equity, but also feel like other than economic barriers or access barriers, the sport is open, right? And the sport is very welcoming. So we really have to look at what causes the barriers to access and what is our role in expanding access, removing some of those barriers and increasing the diversity, not just in our sport, but also in our membership, in our staff, and in our board.
So public lands, if somebody just doesn't know a lot about how public lands are operated, then I think, well, they're public, right? So anybody can go out there to build a trail or use them for whatever they want. So
we think anyways.
So first of all, is that true? Can anybody go out to public lands and build a trail because they're public lands?
Well, the instant answer is no, but they are accessible to everyone. So yes, you can go out to public lands, you can enjoy them, you can recreate them following the land manager's rules and the management objectives of the trail or the trail network that you find yourself on. And that's across all recreation, whether you're boating, climbing, there are rules and regulations that exist and are in place to make sure that over the long term, all those recreation resources are protected and sustainable, and it's just as beautiful of a user experience for the next generation as it is for us right now. And in order to keep it that way, we do have to follow certain rules. They differ from land manager to land manager, so it's really important to know when you go out to recreate, whose land are you on? What are the management objectives of the trail? So is it multi-use? Is it, could you encounter horses and hikers, or is this just for mountain biking? And then abide by the rules that are in place. And then know that if you want to take matters in your own hands, you can do that, but only if you go with a organization like Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance or Washington Trails Association, who host volunteer work party opportunities. So you can actually dig on that land. There are liability insurance forms in place. We follow land manager protocols, and we get assigned work parties where the work is actually needed. So yeah, each park, each national forest, or each state agency land will have different guidelines. I'll wrap that up by saying that in general, for people who think that it is all open game and I pay taxes for this public land, so I should have access and I should be able to do what I like to do, on average, and I haven't ran the numbers recently, but in prior Evergreen review of this, it takes about 7 years to go from trail development concept to actually building it. And that's because of the public review process, the NEPA or SEPA that might have to be completed, the cultural resource review, the design reviews, public comments, and then having the funds secured either through state grants or through our own local fundraising to be able to then build the trail. So trails overall take an enormous amount of planning, resources, investments, community support to make them happen. So they're very special, and they should be considered to be special, and not treated as something that is just suddenly there or you can just go ahead and create.
So thinking about in that process, what are some of the things that create the most amount of friction or obstacles when you're trying to advocate and get a new trail in?
Well, funding is, of course, a barrier, and communicating the need and the demand, and then working with the land managers that this is a place that's unique and perfect for a mountain bike trail network, and then working with the community to help support us in that, right? Whether it's just a lack of access to recreation for that community, or a desire to have positive economic impacts from recreation that comes to their town. Maybe there's an identity that a community wants to create around this is the place to come mountain biking, right? So there really are all these different factors that go into determining where a network can be created sustainably, financially reasonable, and will be a success. We get multiple calls into Evergreen with requests for mountain bike trail networks where we just say, you know, we just don't think we can build something that'll be successful in the long run. And so there are a number of considerations just like that that we have to keep in mind when we do a proposal. Then when the proposal, you know, is somewhat refined, of course, we got to get buy-in from a whole bunch of partners and the land managers, then apply for grants to be able to get them funded and make sure that ongoing funding for operations and maintenance is also pretty well secured before we get the green light to go and build.
What sort of things can mountain bikers do to help reduce that friction for Evergreen or even just for any trail alliance?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I mentioned before, by like the origins of our organization is volunteerism. And if we didn't have volunteers to bring the volunteer hours to the land managers to help maintain and operate their trails and help with the backlog that exists for maintenance activities, we wouldn't be where we are right now. And what I'm noticing and what we're trying to address at the moment in our volunteer program, Bobby Stewart is leading that for Evergreen. Newer riders coming into the sport aren't familiar with that as much because they come to the sport with a lot of trails already there. They haven't gone through the process of, like you said, the fight and the friction of creating the need and establishing that sort of like mountain bike trails are a worthy statewide investment, right? And so there isn't that history anymore of, oh, for every 10 hours that I ride my bike, I should dig 1 hour with a recreation organization. Whether it's WTA or us or the Backcountry Horsemen, it doesn't matter. But mountain bikers can pitch in to keep the trails in the shape that they are and to assist the land managers in the way that says, thank you, and I'm willing to help keep this in shape. And I'm going to do that in a formal way.
A number of the trails are shared use, like with hikers, for example. Why are some trails shared use and some dedicated?
Yeah, so I'd say historically most of the trails were shared use, and I'm talking non-motorized trails. There already is a very distinct, difference between motorized and non-motorized trails. Mountain bikers had to work very, very hard to keep their place on non-motorized trails and make the case that a bicycle is a non-motorized way of recreation and therefore they should be allowed. So the very early advocacy was simply about, no, we deserve to be on these trails. And it was difficult, 30 years ago, convincing hikers and equestrians was a big challenge. And those challenges are not gone in some places, right? Especially if as trails get busier with increasing use, there's this sense of increasing conflict. Some of them are designated that way. What's happening now is in all of our new development and our new project proposals, we basically have made a strong case over the past decade or so that, hey, hikers have their own trails in wilderness, equestrians have their own trails in wilderness. Mountain bikers deserve some of their own trails as well. So you'll see some of the newer trails being mountain biking only or mountain bike priority objective. Hikers are pretty much always welcome, but they are becoming more directional. And so, a hiker going up a directional downhill trail is not a good thing. So as things get busier and as visions and plans are built up and mountain biking became a recreation group that deserved its own trail, we then were able to get our own designated management objective that is priority mountain biking. So you'll see that most of the newer trails have that management objective, and that allows us to then build a trail for mountain biking as opposed to build it for all three users. So it gives us the green light to put in features that mountain bikers really, really enjoy that maybe equestrians and hikers wouldn't really care about.
Yeah, having just ridden at Darrington this last weekend, I can imagine, hikers probably wouldn't like those trails and equestrians certainly wouldn't like those trails.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's say I'm a mountain biker, I'm on a shared use trail, and I go by a hiker's not happy with me being on the trail, how would you suggest somebody respond in that sort of situation?
Yeah, as a community, I think most of us inherently know this, right? You respect every user on the trail and you follow trail etiquette. For the most part, we stop every time we see a hiker, and we're always friendly and we let the hiker pass. If we're coming up behind the hiker, we let them know that we're there. We kindly ask to pass. Same with equestrians. We always pull off. I think really it's just the respect that everybody who's on that trail that's following the management objectives of that trail deserves to be there and deserves to have a good time. And there really is no benefit in creating conflict. Are there equestrians and mountain bikers and hikers who would rather not have those other users on the trail? Absolutely. And sometimes you see some behavior that's less than ideal. But in the end, I think, we are all out there enjoying the land. And is it really so bad to slow down and say hi to a fellow trail user? I frankly, personally get joy out of every encounter I have with an equestrian on the trail. I've been very fortunate that I think if you arrive with a certain attitude, you also receive that attitude back. Every once in a while you don't, but that's okay too, right? And so it's just about courtesy, respecting the other users, and finding the joy in the shared use rather than the conflict. I personally still believe that multi-use trails are wonderful, should continue to exist. And if you are personally not interested to that, then you can go to a mountain bike priority riding trail network and get your mountain bike fix there, yeah. Right? But be courteous, respect others, and respect the rules of the trail.
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas where social media kind of gives an inaccurate perspective on things, because oftentimes you only ever see the complaints, or when there's a problem, somebody says, oh, I was passing this type of user and they responded this way and it made me upset. And then meanwhile, like for me, like I know I went to a trail up north of Seattle and I parked in a certain spot, and somebody came over to me and said, hey, could you not park here? They could see my bike on the car, and I knew it was a mountain biker. And they're like, because, trucks with trailers, the equestrians, they need to be able to turn around right here.
Yeah.
This is a dirt lot. I can't tell. There's no signs or anything. And I'm like, oh yeah, sure. And they were super nice about it. And so even though there was a little bit of a conflict there, they were nice. I had no problem moving my car over to this other spot. Like it's fine. And every time I've been on a trail where I come across an equestrian or hiker, like it's always been a positive experience, with maybe a few very rare exceptions. But
yeah,
social media, if you looked at it, you pretty much only ever see when there's a conflict.
It can quickly become a race to the bottom. And I think we have to all realize when we read those comments that for every negative encounter that's posted, there are 100 positive encounters that are not talked about, right? And so it tends to be more amplified. That said, we also pay attention. And if we see the same complaint in one area happening over and over again, we also know that it's time to step in. But yeah, it's social media, sort of a blessing and a curse. But go to the Evergreen website, follow our social media feed. We do etiquette reminders. We did a Recreate Responsibly video and education around, hey, if you go out to the land during COVID, how can you recreate responsibly, and what would land managers and other recreation organizations like to see you do? So take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, social media is what it is. And like I said, a blessing and a curse.
Moving on to another topic now, e-bikes. For people just coming up to speed on mountain biking and e-bikes in Washington State, tell us a little bit about Evergreen's involvement with the current e-bike legislation in Washington State.
Yeah, so this could be a whole topic on its own, right? But I'll try to summarize sort of our role and what's next. E-bikes are coming onto the market incredibly fast, and the way I see it, it is a new technology that's being pushed onto an infrastructure that's not ready for it. So our role really is to find a way to create that infrastructure to make sure that allowing that technology on existing non-motorized trails where sustainable, right, can be done responsibly and make sense. It's a very tricky and tough question. The technology is here to stay. There's no doubt. And for commuting purposes and on paved trails, long distance trails, the technology makes absolute sense. And in terms of diversity and equity, it opens up access to people who otherwise might not be able to experience our sport, right? So there is a rule, it's here to stay. We engaged a few years ago in the legislation that Washington State passed to allow e-bikes on regional long distance trails, enhanced surface long distance non-paved trails. So for example, an Iron Horse or so, it's a crushed rock long distance travel trail. But we also made sure that there wouldn't be blanket access to all single track because there's too many challenges, issues, and community concerns around that. So we wrote or helped write legislation that would make sure that we could work with land managers to allow e-bike legal trails where sustainable and reasonable, and then it also gave the land managers basically the authority to make their trails, their non-motorized single track soft surface trails, legal to e-bikes. And so since then, we've done a number of e-bike presentations, just obtaining feedback, seeing where the community is. We've done surveys, land managers have done surveys, and we're doing a pilot with the Department of Natural Resources at Darrington. But the way I'm personally approaching it in my advocacy work is that the technology is here to stay, so how do we introduce it sustainably and not too fast? And basically with all new project development that is mountain bike priority, why not? There is no prior user experience there. There's no historic use that could be upset by the addition of e-bikes. It's a new system. That new system is built for the new technology. Why not open it up, right? On existing trails, and particularly multi-use trails, you've got to consider the hikers and the equestrians and other mountain bikers who might not be as excited about the technology. It does change your user experience. So we look at opportunities where it makes sense, and new trails, why not? As long as the land manager is okay with that, we'll push for it. And then slowly but surely make sure that there is more access because more and more people are buying these bikes. The request from Evergreen is that all new e-bike users treat the trails as closed unless signed open. And so do your research, as I mentioned before, check out where you're going. We have resources on our Evergreen website on where you can ride your e-bike. There are hundreds and hundreds of motorized single track trails that e-bikes can access now, but they might not be as close to your home as you would like to. And so you do have to travel some further distances, and we're working to look at opportunities for more close by networks that could be e-bike legal. It's going to take time. It's not moving fast enough for the industry and not fast enough for many e-bike users. But like I said, the request is treat them as closed unless signed open and respect the land manager regulations. I know it's tough sometimes, but I'm seeing a number of people who are just blatantly saying, hey, I'm entitled to use these trails. This is a non-motorized piece of equipment. And that's defined by state law now, that an e-bike is non-motorized equipment. And it's a slippery slope. We had a lot of instances in King County, for example, in the old days where the motorized community was being kicked off of the trails, and they basically have no places left to ride in King County. As a community, for the most part, they've respected that, right? And it was very frustrating for them. They lost their riding areas. And so if we as a community ignore the rules and we start riding on these trails, then why shouldn't they start riding on these trails again too? Right? So it's a slippery slope. Like I said, we're working very diligently on creating more riding opportunities, but we just have to request that people realize that it's a bigger deal than it seems, and that it even could be tied to our eligibility for non-motorized grant funding. So we are dealing with it in multiple ways, and probably not fast enough, but certainly making progress.
A couple of things in there that stood out to me. One is that it's very nuanced. There's a lot more details that go into it than what people might just think of, like, well, you just say yes, or you just say no, and where is it? And really there's a lot of intricacies, like the grant thing, which I had heard of before. I think a lot of people don't understand that like Evergreen runs off grants and other types of funding, and they need that. And this plays into that whole process. And without that, that means fewer trails for anybody.
Yeah.
And so it's great to hear that you're working on making it so the new trails that are going in are e-bike friendly and allow those. I was up at Darrington, like I mentioned, over the weekend, and I saw e-biker up there. He smoked me downhill too. So,
Yeah, they are, the community is picking them up quickly. They're fun. They're great. You get to ride a lot more miles, much easier. I have multiple calls coming into the office of people who have had an injury, and the only way they can ride their favorite trails or keep up with their, fast progressing teenage son or daughter, and mom and dad are with them on an e-bike, right? So there are multiple benefits to the technology. There's no doubt. Putting the rules in place is challenging, and it's taken an amazing amount of my time to try and create an environment where that is actually balanced and manageable in the long run.
That wraps up most of my questions. I got one final one for you. And again, we're thinking about new mountain bikers just coming into the sport, not really knowing what advocacy is. What words of wisdom or other thoughts would you like to share with them?
New mountain bikers, well, become a member of Evergreen, right? You find a lot of resources, and the more members we have, the bigger our voices in Olympia, the more we can push legislators, elected officials to help us. First confirm and secure funding for recreation, and then ultimately see the benefits in their community for economic impacts, but also just community health, right? The benefits of being in the outdoors. So the more members, the better for us. Sign up for an education class. So look at our calendar, look at our education offerings, learn about the etiquette through our education classes, learn about mountain bike skills through our education classes. There's so many resources out there, and there are also private instructors in the market who offer mountain bike clinics and classes. And you just learn so much just by taking one or two classes and being on the trail with other people. Every rule in terms of going out into the outdoors safely that you hear through any other organizations apply to mountain biking as well, right? So bring the 10 essentials every time. Right now with COVID, follow the Recreate Responsibly guidelines. There are just a number of baseline sort of safety conditions that every mountain biker should know about, so that you don't get stuck in the wilderness. We've seen an enormous amount of increase in rescue efforts this year, both in the hiking and the mountain bike community, with people just getting out too far beyond what they're used to doing, not bringing enough water, not bringing the appropriate maps, and then needing to be rescued or, ride beyond their capability on the trail they don't know, and have an injury, unfortunately, along the way. So be safe, do your research, know where you're going, follow the guidelines. And really, that gets you a long way. It's common sense, right?
I really appreciate your time. Thank you for all of your efforts in helping making the great trails we have better and expanding those trails, and all the work that it takes behind the scenes that we don't see, even beyond the trail building and everything else. So really appreciate that, and thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Appreciate being here.